time, but I haven't been given the go-ahead to start yet. I hope that's okay that I'll begin, if it's okay with you. Hello, everybody. My name is Bruce Honer. I am a training officer out of Region 9. My office is in San Francisco. I have worked in the financial aid industry for 24 years now. 10 of those years worked at various colleges and universities, doing everything from student loan coordinator, financial aid counselor, director of financial aid, scholarships coordinator, you name it. I did it, all right, over a span of 10 years in the western coast of the United States. And that's just who I am. I'll be the only one who will be presenting this information to you. I do want to let you know that we're going to handle this a little bit differently. Normally, because we have such a large group, and because this is also being recorded, we're going to ask that you hold off on asking questions until the session is over. I will give you some time to do that. Also, keep in mind when I'm not up here presenting, I am over at the Ask a Fed desk. Come and get me over there and talk to me about it. And I happen to know all of those folks who are manning the Ask a Fed in the Resource Center. They're all very capable, and they can answer any of your questions as well. I will also like to remind you that there will be evaluations that will be emailed to you as it pertains to this particular session. That we certainly encourage you to do that, to let us know what we could have done better. Okay, that said, done with the housekeeping rules here, let's talk about it. I hope you don't mind. I am a wanderer. I don't like to stand behind a podium like this. So I got to be honest with you. I recommended to do this Administering Disbursements. To my dismay, as I began to develop it, I realized that there's some despair here. There's a lot of information that is included. So I think that because it is such, there is so much depth as pertains to disbursements, which is why I actually recommended it. There's so many details that are involved. I really do want to encourage you to ask questions, especially when we're done, obviously not during the session. But please, by all means, not only, even though I'm not available after the session is over, please feel free to email me or call me. You have my contact information at the end of this particular session if you have any follow-up questions that you think warrant my attention. Okay, I'm happy to do that for you. Okay, so that said, let's have fun with this. Let's talk about administering disbursements. So my agenda for you is I'm going to give you an overview of disbursements. Then I'm going to go into the various types of disbursements, such as the early, late, post-withdrawal, which is a type of late disbursement. I'll talk about retroactive disbursements, and then I'll talk about credit balances. And then I decided I want to talk to you about disbursements when regaining eligibility. And I like to do this because, quite frankly, it's not an easy thing to find anywhere in your FSA handbook. And then, of course, when we're dealing with disbursements and we've made them, there's sometimes when we have to return those funds that we've given to our students. I'll talk about returning funds as well at the end. So let's begin with the disbursement overview, okay? So let's talk about the funding. Before we actually make disbursements, let's talk about how things are funded. Again, keep in mind, when we use our G5, when we use the G5 system, that system as basically Ed's payment system, keeping in mind that it is specific for each program and for each award year. Okay, meaning that funding is not student specific. So I know that we have a lot of financial aid administrators here, but when your bursar's office or your business office is going in there, because they're the ones who will typically go in and draw down those funds from our G5 system, they're not drawing it down for Susie Smith or Robert Jones over here. They're drawing it down based on the total amount of disbursement funds that are going to be eventually dispersed to those individual students. And so they're going to go into the G5 system looking into the award year for which they're drawing down those funds and the type of program for which they're drawing those funds down, such as Pell Grant funds, direct loan funds, and so on and so forth. Now, yes, I'm talking about funding basics, but why do I care then, if I'm talking about funding basics, about the timing and deadlines for reporting disbursements to COD? Because quite frankly, as you'll see in our next slide here, that it is by reporting certain funds to COD, funds are not actually generated into G5 until that actual reporting occurs, and you'll see that in just a little bit. But keep in mind that as it pertains to the timeline and deadlines for reporting those disbursements to COD, you have basically 7 days prior to the disbursement date, and also prior to the disbursement date to report that actual disbursement. I am talking about an actual disbursement, but it can be reported no later than 15 days after the actual disbursement occurring. All right, so let's take a big picture of what I'm going to be, take a bigger picture of some things here. So what's going to happen here is I'm going to go to my financial aid system for Pell Grant funds, and I'm going to report the actual disbursement that I'm going to be making on the Pell Grant funds. Notice that if I am a school that is using actual federal funds to apply against a student account first instead of using my own funds first, guess what? I am not going to be able to draw down any funds from G5 to report to COD. In other words, I have to report to COD if I'm going to draw down the funds first, the actual disbursement amount that I'm going to disperse to the student. Because what happens by reporting that to COD, COD then takes that actual disbursement amount for that particular student and then reports that to the G5 system, and then those funds are generated in the G5 system and then become available for you to draw down. Okay, so that's why if you're a school that does not use your own money, you need to do that reporting that 7 days, up to 7 days prior to the actual disbursement. Now, things do become relatively easy if I'm a school that is using my own funds, right? Because now if I'm a school that is using my own funds to disperse against a student's account, guess what? I don't have to worry about being able to draw down those funds dispersed against a student's account until after the fact that I've made the disbursement. So I don't have to report that to COD, okay, 7 days prior. That's the instance in which if I'm using my own funds to draw down, to apply against a student's account, I can have up to 15 days to report that to COD because I'm not relying on those funds being available in G5 in order for me to apply it against a student's account. Does that make sense? So for direct loans, it's different. It is the reporting of actual disbursements that do not actually generate that money that's being drawn down from the G5 system. Okay, so typically, you're not really required to report that actual disbursement to the direct loan in order for those funds to become available, is what I'm trying to say here. What we'll do is we'll take 50% of the total sum of direct loan funds that you dispersed in the prior year and make that available. We'll make that available in the G5 system for you to draw down up front. And as you continue to report actual disbursements throughout the year, we'll gradually increase that funding level in the G5 system. Now, for those of you that have a very large student population, you may run into instances where you have tried to draw down funds, but now you don't have enough in the G5 system because maybe you have a big student population, you're making a big disbursement, and all of a sudden it's not available. If that happens, just contact COD operations and let them know, hey, listen, we're going to draw down a larger amount of funds that we're going to have to disperse. We need to increase the funding level for my direct loans. And they'll make that happen so you can draw down that money and then make sure that you can go ahead and disperse the funds and then report that disbursement later on, okay? So basically, the actual disbursement that is being reported to COD, all that's really happening is that you're substantiating, by reporting that to which students were receiving those funds, you're substantiating the drawdown of funds that you have already made by letting COD know where those funds went to, by reporting those individual students. So here's the big picture of how it's going to work, right? You make that drawdown request. You have those funds, let's say you request it today. Those funds hit your federal funds account tomorrow. Okay, the day that it hits your federal funds account, let's say today is Monday, and it is, and you know that it hits your federal funds account, you request it today, it hits your federal funds account on Tuesday. We say that you have 3, notice, business days to disperse those funds. So I'm saying starting on Tuesday, guess what? Wednesday, close of business is my first day. Thursday is my second day. By the close of business on Friday, I better have dispersed those funds against the student's account. So I have 3 business days from the time that it hits my federal funds account. Okay? Now, that's for any type of disbursement. That's an early disbursement. I'm going to draw it down. I have 3 business days to disperse it, whether it be a disbursement within the payment period, whether it be a late or post-withdrawal or a retroactive disbursement, the process is still the same. That's how it's going to work. Then, once I make that disbursement and I apply it against the student's account, I'm then going to satisfy any institutional costs that the student owes me. Anything above and beyond those institutional costs, okay, then becomes a Title IV credit balance. Now, it becomes a Title IV credit balance the day that you disperse those funds against the student's account. And then notice that you have 14 calendar days, not business days, but then you only have 14 calendar days to then disperse those funds to the student and parent. And don't worry, I'll talk a lot about credit balances. This is just a high overview to either the student or parent, okay? I'll get into this much more in greater detail later on. Now, again, the key here is that when you request those funds, you're not requesting funds that exceed what we call the immediate need. In other words, I can't say, well, you know what, I sure would like to have $50,000 in our federal funds account, and maybe I'll go ahead and give it to some students. Okay, eventually I'll go ahead and get it out to them. So when we say immediate need, it means, guess what? If you're going to draw down $50,000, you better be dispersing $50,000 against individual students' accounts by the 3rd day from the time it hits your federal account. That's what we mean by immediate need. You're drawing it down because you already have the students that you know you're going to disperse it against within 3 business days from the time that it hits your federal funds account. Otherwise, it's called excess cash. Now, I'm not going to get into a lot about excess cash, but yeah, there's some fines and penalties that are involved if you hold it beyond that period of time. But this is not cash management. Okay, I would encourage you to go to your FSA handbook, volume 4, to learn more about that. But again, it becomes excess cash, and all you need to know for now is that's a bad thing. Okay, you don't want that to happen. Let's continue on with disbursements. Now, what is a disbursement? This is how we define disbursements. We define it as a day a school. Again, you notice how I used this earlier. The day a school credits a student's account at the school or pays a student or parent directly with, right, funds received from the department, that money you drew down from the G5 system. So that's where I'm going to take that money. I'm going to wait till I draw it down first. I'm going to take that money I drew down. I'm going to apply it against the student's account. Or, guess what? I'm going to use my own school funds. That's where I use my own schools. I disperse it. Maybe I'll draw it down later to reimburse myself. But that day that I disperse it, even if I'm using my own funds, that's the disbursement date. That's the actual disbursement date that I'm reporting to CLD. Whether it's the federal funds or my school funds that I'm using, it still becomes Title IV funds that were dispersed against the student on the actual disbursement date that you put it against the student's account. Okay? Now notice the second bullet. School funds used in advance of receiving funds from the department within regulatory timeframes. There are some schools that what they'll do is, listen, I'll go ahead and I'll disperse maybe those funds 30 days even before the term begins because I can do that. It's my money. I can do whatever I want. Understand it does not become an actual disbursement for Title IV purposes until it falls within our regulatory timeframe guidelines, such as if you're going to do it 30 days prior to, it does not become an actual disbursement until it's at least 10 days prior to the term starting, because that's the earliest you can make an early disbursement, you see? So long as you're using your own funds, that's great. You can do that whenever you want. But it doesn't become an actual disbursement until it falls within the guidelines of our own timeframes. Okay? Notice the disbursement date must be reported to CLD. The disbursement date must be the actual disbursement date. Sorry, let me say that in a different way. What you report to CLD as your actual disbursement date better be the date that you have dispersed it against the student's account. That's what they're saying. Because a lot of things happen, right, based off that actual disbursement date. Now, the biggest thing that happens is that you're reporting to CLD what the actual disbursement date is for that direct loan, for instance. I gave them direct loan funds on this day. It was on Tuesday. Okay, but maybe the actual disbursement date, you actually didn't pull down the funds and put it against the student's account until Friday. Well, guess what? You just gave that student a gift of 3 days worth of interest accrued. Enjoy that. Okay? That they really did not actually accrue. So we're very serious that when you actually apply those funds against the student's account, that's the actual disbursement date that you're reporting to COD. It means a lot to us, enough to make sure that you do the same, that you do it. Okay? Good. All right. So again, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk to you about notifications. Now, the truth is I could spend a lot of time talking about notifications. But I think I'd be remiss if I didn't talk to you about the notification of disbursement that you have to make to your students. And again, the key here is that if you're going to make a disbursement, you must notify the student of the amount of funds that you're expected, amount of funds you're expected to receive for each FSA program. And you must provide that prior to the disbursement actually occurring, and must include how and when the disbursement will occur. Now, that's all Title IV aid. Now, for direct loans, we'd added an additional caveat to that. We also noticed that we added the student's parent's right to cancel all or portion of the loan. So as a part of that notification, if it includes direct loans, make sure that you're letting them know that, hey, by the way, you're taking out these student loans, and if you decide you want to cancel any portion of this or the whole thing, you can do that. And here is a procedure on how to do that. Okay? Now, I'm simplifying this because, again, this isn't cash management, but I really encourage you. There's a lot that goes along with that to take a look in your FSA Handbook Volume 4 to get into more detail. But that's essentially it in a nutshell. Then we have this thing called authorizations, and you'll see that this kind of shows up throughout the entire session, so I'm not going to get into it a whole lot right here. But then authorizations, basically, the school is going to have to obtain what we call an authorization, right, from the student before performing any of these particular activities that I'm talking about, right? In other words, I'm going to disperse those funds, and I must get authorization from the parent or from the student to disperse those funds to pay for any other allowable charges besides tuition, books, and fees. Of course, provided, of course, are tuition and fees and room and board only if you contract room and board at your school. Notice how I said books and fees, because some of you can include books and supplies as a part of your fees if you meet the particular conditions for that, okay? But if you're going to apply Title IV aid against anything else besides those things, you better have an authorization to do that from the parent or student. Also make sure, as it pertains to federal work study students, you cannot apply federal work study wages against even allowable charges without their authorization to do so. And to keep it simple, right, even dispersing federal work study funds electronically to a bank account, you have to have their authorization to do that. And of course, the old FSA credit balance, I'll talk about that quite a bit later on. You better have an authorization to hold on to an FSA credit balance. So a lot of this is high overview. Don't worry, I will get into more detail as we go along. So the other big thing here is determining eligibility before disbursement. Yes, right? A lot of this is, sure, a lot of us have heard this, before dispersing funds, you must determine and document that the student remains eligible to receive the type and amount of FSA funds that you expect to disperse. Now, generally, this is something that we've already done. When we award our student, we're not awarding our student unless we already know that they meet both the ICER determined eligibility requirements, such as citizenship, drug-related issues, and so on and so forth, meaning that we've given them the go-ahead in accordance with what they put in the ICER. And there's nothing that needs to be looked into in accordance with maybe a C code or a reject. Okay, that's all been resolved. And we typically do this even before awarding the student. Same thing with school determined eligibility, making sure they're a regular student, that they're enrolled in an eligible program for Title IV funds, or they're meeting SAP conditions. So why do I have to go back and look at it? Not only I did that when I awarded it, right? Well, I want it back before I disperse those funds. Notice how we're saying you have to make sure that they're still eligible. Maybe I make a disbursement 2 weeks into the term start. And maybe what happens is I may have anticipated a disbursement amount based on a particular enrollment status. The big key here is looking at the amount that I originally said that they're eligible to receive. And you know, for instance, that my enrollment status may fluctuate up and down up until the time that I make that disbursement. Now, whether or not I have Pell that I'm dispersing, and I have a Pell recalculation date, and so on and so forth. So you have an obligation to determine, sure, are they still eligible, but also am I dispersing the correct amount for this particular student? You have a responsibility to do that, okay? And notice that both you and your third-party servicer must have a process in place to make this determination. We make that third-party servicer equally as liable as you do. It wasn't always that case, but they now have a fiduciary responsibility of ensuring the student is eligible prior to making those disbursements. Now, this is the other thing, right? And some of this stuff you've already heard before, right? But we have, as it pertains to disbursements, we have a 30-day delay for those first-time, first-year borrowers. We cannot disperse those funds until that 30 days have passed. It's after the 30 days have passed, so it's on the 31st day that you're able to make that disbursement. So let's be clear about that. Okay? Of course, you know about the exception, I hope, that there is an exception if you have a cohort default rate of less than 15% for the 3 most fiscal years, or here, if you're a school with the most recent cohort default rate of less than 5%, and you're originating loans to cover the cost of attendance in a study abroad program. There's the other exception. Now here we're talking about single payment period disbursements. This is where I have a loan period that encompasses only one payment period. So let's not get confused. This is not a payment period, any kind of payment period. If I have 2 payment periods within a loan period, this does not apply, certainly. But this pertains to those instances, maybe for you schools, that you traditional schools, you have a spring term, and that's when my students start, and that's the only term my student is going to attend within the award year before they wait and attend again in the fall. So I'm going to have a single payment period, and my loan period is only going to cover that payment period, and that's what this is talking about. So when you have that particular instance, this gets a little interesting. When a direct loan is made for one payment period, the loan must be dispersed in 2 installments. And the second installment may not be dispersed until the student has completed half of the payment period. Now, what does that mean? That means for you traditional schools that have standard terms, you're not non-term, you're not non-standard term that's not substantially equal or anything like that. You have traditional terms, and this is talking about direct loans. That means at the halfway calendar point of that payment period, that's when you're allowed to make that second disbursement. So you cut that disbursement in half for that payment period. That first one's made at the beginning of the term or whenever you want to make it. It can even be an early disbursement, but that second one better not occur prior to that calendar midpoint of that term. You clock hour, non-term credit hour schools. You schools that have terms that are not substantially equal, that are non-standard. Okay, you're under a BBA 3 environment, so you have to wait, guess what, until my student has reached both the number of hours and weeks completed at that halfway point, and that's when you get to make that second disbursement. Okay? Of course, same exceptions as we had before. If you meet these cohort default rate exceptions, then you go ahead and, you're not bound to that. Get that default rate down. That'd be nice, right? So you can make one single disbursement. Let's talk about modules, right? Because those are fun. Now, a student who is enrolled in a module within a payment period is enrolled for the entire payment period. So what does that mean? That basically means that when I have a loan period, just because I only have a student who's enrolled in a shorter class, it does not span the full length of the payment period. That does not mean that my loan period only consists of that one class. My loan period consists of the entire payment period. Okay? The cost of attendance excludes, and a lot of schools are missing this. The cost of attendance excludes periods of non-attendance. So I have 3 modules within the same term, Module 1, 2, and 3. Student is enrolled in Module 1, enrolled in Module 3, but they're not in attendance for Module 2, which is maybe maybe just 5 weeks of the term. Now, sure, we get tuition, right? Maybe it's still 6 credit hours and it's half-time enrollment. But guess what? Those living expenses, you can't include it for those 5 weeks. Now, we don't tell you how you have to calculate that. We just tell you have to figure that out. Okay, so enjoy that. Just make sure you do it. Okay? Now, disbursements cannot be scheduled during, I already said that. Oh, no, I didn't. Also, when you're scheduling disbursements, make sure that you're not scheduling them during periods of non-attendance in a modular environment. Okay? I don't say it here, but I want to say this really quick. If I am a student who is in a single module, my student is still enrolled for the entire term. Enrolled. They may not be attending during the entire term, but the student is still enrolled for the entire term. And I bring this up because sometimes schools get confused. Well, hold on. And you'll hear me talk about late disbursements a little bit later on, but since I'm talking about modules, I'll bring it up here. If I have a student who attended Module 1, completed Module 1, maybe 2 modules within that period of time, and they were half-time, and then after the fact that module is over but the term has not ended, they decide they want a student loan now for the first time. The student is still enrolled in the term. Therefore, it's not even a late disbursement. You're allowed to make it, because they're still enrolled in the term, and they're enrolled half-time. You get it? So I just wanted to bring that up, because that's not something that people really think about when they're thinking about modules and being enrolled. They're still enrolled for the entire term, and that means there's a lot of implication that goes along with that. I just wanted to point that out. Now, again, this is just the same case. You can either make a single disbursement based on the enrollment status for the entire term, because they're enrolled for the entire term. So if I want to make a single disbursement at the beginning of the term, even though my student hasn't begun attendance, and for a module that might be coming up maybe 6 weeks later, it doesn't matter, they're enrolled, and I can go ahead and make a single disbursement on the basis of the fact that they're enrolled at least for that class to start a little bit later on. So I can do that at the very beginning if I so choose. Okay? But keep in mind, as pertains to Pell, my student must begin attendance in all credits used to establish the enrollment status, or Pell recalculation is required. So I make that single disbursement for Pell at the very beginning because I know my student is enrolled in several modules throughout the term, but guess what? My student doesn't show up for those later modules. They didn't begin attendance in them. And I know what you're going to say. Hey, Bruce, I'm a school that's not required to take attendance, so there, I get away with that. No, you don't. You don't get away with that because we're very clear that if you're a school that is not required to take attendance, you're still a school that is required to have a procedure in place that determines whether or not the student began attendance, that substantiates that enrollment status for which you've based that Pell Grant amount for that particular payment period. You get it? Otherwise, there's going to have to be a recalculation if they don't begin attendance. All right? Now, as pertains to direct loans, change in enrollment status to less than half-time results in cancellation of subsequent loan disbursements. So if you're like a lot of schools, some of you like to break up the disbursements anyway throughout the term, just in case they drop or they withdraw, and it saves you some money that you have to return otherwise, right? Just becomes that aid that was already dispersed. So if that happens, just keep in mind, you've already made the disbursement. Now they subsequently, of making the disbursement, have dropped to less than half-time, right? You're not allowed to make any subsequent disbursements, obviously, because they're not, right, at least half-time. You'll see me change my mind on that later. That's fun. But let's continue. Okay, so the other thing to keep in mind is that a school can schedule multiple disbursements throughout the payment period not to exceed the permitted amount. So all I'm saying here is that, yeah, I have a payment period. I'm only allowed to disperse the amount that's associated with that payment period. But a lot of schools ask this, especially as it pertains to modules, just like I said earlier, can I break it up into 3 different disbursements? So I can just give them some at the beginning, and I know they're probably going to drop, so I'm going to do maybe the other second, third, and then the final disbursement, a little bit later on. Yeah, you can do that. There's nothing to prohibit you from doing that. Okay, you can do that. All right, let's talk about early disbursements. Let's begin into the different types of disbursements. Wow, that was special. All right, how did that happen? I hit the, let's try this again. I did, I hit the, yeah, sorry. Oh, wow, nice, okay. That's okay. Great, early disbursements, let's talk about it. So again, the idea is we can make a disbursement. When I talk about early disbursement, it's about dispersing before the term even begins. And the earliest the school can disperse title funds depends on the type of program the student is enrolled in, right? So if it happens to be a traditional standard term credit hour program, we all know that we can go ahead and disperse our funds as early as 10 days before the first day of class. Or in a modular environment, notice this, 10 days, again, before class starts. Notice it's not before the term. So if I have a student who's only enrolled in Module 3, you better not be dispersing those funds 10 days prior to the term start. It better not be made until 10 days prior to Module 3. You see that? That's what has to happen. That's an early disbursement. Now, you clock hour or non-term credit hour or you non-standard terms that are not substantially equal, because of how the program works, meaning my student has to complete half the weeks and half the hours before I can make that second disbursement, you cannot be still attending another payment period and make that early disbursements. That's why we say, if I have 10 days between the two different payment periods, that's great. I can go ahead and disperse it as early as 10 days. Or no more than the date the student, or if the student is still enrolled in a payment period, I can't do it 10 days prior to, but I can do it as soon as the student completes that previous payment period. So the earliest of the two, okay? Or the later of the two, excuse me. Oh my gosh. I know what to do now. I am so sorry. Well, let's say that this is not a recording that's going to be on the system. Let's hope they use tomorrow's. Okay, so sorry. Okay. All right. Good, here we are. So again, my student fails to begin attendance, right? If the school disperses Pell, again, if my student fails to begin attendance, and I'm talking about basically grant aid, basically the Pell, SEOG, or even teach, right? Again, notice how we're just being straight to the point here. If they fail to begin attendance and it's an early disbursement, it's really simple. You need to return the money. You, the school, needs to return the money that was dispersed because they never began attendance. Now, it's a little different if the school disperses either of these types of aid, Pell, Iraq, Afghanistan, and teach, right? And the student begins some, but not all classes, right? It's pretty simple. You have to recalculate in accordance with whatever their new enrollment status is. And by the way, if you didn't catch this already, we have an add, drops, and withdrawal session that we do every day. So we really go into great depth on this, okay? But you're going to have to recalculate in accordance with whatever the enrollment status is that they actually did begin in, okay? Or in accordance with whatever your Pell recalculation date says your enrollment status is at that particular point in time. Now, the one thing that we don't mention is, guess what? If we did an early disbursement for a full-time student, and the student only begins attendance, let's say, half-time, the truth of the matter is the student is the one who's liable. This is a student liability. Technically, the student is responsible to return those funds. But let's be honest, do you want to go through that? This is why schools don't deal with this. They say, well, we'll just return it. Let the student continue to go through class, right? Instead of me reporting this as an overpayment if they refuse to pay the difference and so on and so forth. Okay? But technically, it's the student who's liable for that amount that they were not eligible for because they're the ones who began as a less than full-time student. Okay? Just wanted to point that out to you for fun. Now, if my student fails to begin attendance and I've awarded direct loan funds, it's really straightforward on this, right? The school, again, you're going to return any direct loan funds credited to the student's account. So I credited the student's account. They owed me some money. I know I have that money, but any remaining loan funds dispersed directly to the student, maybe I have a credit balance, right? After I credited the student's account, and I gave that to the student or the parent. Guess what? Right? You have to notify the appropriate servicer of the loan funds that are outstanding so that we can have fun in issuing them a 30-day demand letter to give that back to them. Because guess what? They didn't begin attendance. They don't deserve a single dime of that money. And all of it has to be returned back, okay, to the department. So they're liable for the amount that they have received. Now, what's interesting is this is right out of the regs, right out of your handbook, word for word, and right out of the regulation, word for word. However, what about direct loans if my student begins attendance less than half time? Right? So let's say your student was originally enrolled. You made an early disbursement on the basis of the student being enrolled half time. But when push comes to shove, the student drops the course before the term even begins, and they begin attendance as a less than half-time student. Well, if the beautiful thing is, right, your number one, the big thing is the student doesn't have to repay that money. You don't have to return any portion of that money, nor does the student have to return any portion of that money, even though they began attendance as a less than half-time. They just get to pay it back in accordance to the terms and conditions of the loan. But just make sure that if there are any other subsequent disbursements that are scheduled for that term, you better not be making them, because the student's no longer enrolled at least half-time. Okay? Let's talk about late disbursements. So what is a late disbursement? This is what we say. Basically, I have a student who's eligible to receive Title IV funds. They're eligible, okay? But they become ineligible as a result of one of these two things occurring. To receive FSA funds prior to the disbursement being made. For instance, if it's direct loans and my student is no longer enrolled at least half-time, I am now an ineligible student, and I haven't made that disbursement yet. Prior to making this, or for as it pertains to grants and Perkins loans, any kind of grant, FSA grant or Perkins loan, my student was originally eligible, but guess what? They completely withdrew, right? They're no longer enrolled for that award year, and I haven't made that disbursement yet. However, now we haven't made the disbursement. They're not eligible at this point in time because of one of these two conditions occurred. The idea, though, is the fact that the student did begin attendance, and the student did begin attendance, didn't they? They just ceased being eligible to receive these Title IV funds at some particular point in time, whether it be less than half-time or completely withdrew. And we say a student earns aid through their attendance within any particular payment period. So as a result of that, we say that we must consider that student for what we call a late disbursement because they earned some of that money even though we haven't dispersed it yet. That's what we're saying here. Now, what are the conditions? The number one condition for us to be eligible for a late disbursement is that we have processed the SAR ISER. Notice this word, people miss this, with an official EFC before the student became ineligible. In other words, prior to them either going less than half-time or prior to them completely withdrawing, we better, in order for us to be able to issue a late disbursement, I had to have had, the department had to have processed an ISER with an official EFC. What's an official EFC? Notice it's not a valid EFC. It just means I have a calculated EFC. It doesn't have to be right. It just has to be a calculated EFC. That makes it an official EFC. You hear me talk about valid EFCs a little bit later on in late disbursements, and so there's a slight distinction between the two. So that's my first condition for all Title IV aid. This has to be in place prior to the student becoming ineligible. I have to have that ISER with an official EFC. Can't happen after the fact. You see? The second condition for direct loans only is I must have also originated the record within the school's financial aid system. This kills a lot of schools. They didn't realize this. When they say that I have to have originated that record, they think that I had to have sent it out to COD and got an accepted record back. That's not what that means. It means that you created an electronic origination record in your financial aid system. You've met that condition, period. That's what that means. That's the second condition for them to be eligible for the light disbursement for a direct loan. There's a second condition for FSA, and Perkins, and that means that you just had to have awarded the student, right? Determined that they've met all, made sure that they met all the eligibility requirements and so on and so forth, and you made the award. You meet that condition, then you're fine for those awards, for you to be eligible to make that late disbursement. Sure I'm hitting the right button. Okay. All right, so again, the idea is that late disbursements, they're used only for educational expenses that were incurred while the student was enrolled and eligible. And that disbursement must be made no later than 180 days after the student became ineligible. Okay? Now the key here is if I determine the student's eligible, guess what? I have to attempt to make that late disbursement. Have to attempt to do that. Now this is a little interesting. Let's talk about direct loans, where I may, notice not must, disburse on direct loans. Now remember how I said earlier, if a student did not withdraw but ceased to be enrolled at least half time prior to disbursement, a school may make a late disbursement of direct loan funds. Hold on, Bruce, you're contradicting yourself. You said the opposite earlier. They're no longer enrolled. I can't make any subsequent disbursements. This is saying I haven't even made a disbursement, but guess what? Provided the school previously confirmed the student was enrolled at least half time at the start of the term, I can go ahead and I have the option to make that disbursement anyway. Okay? However, if I choose to make that, I may or I may not. That's at my discretion as a school. Most schools say, no, I'm not going to deal with it. You know why? It's the second part. If a school chooses to make a late disbursement to a student who ceases to be enrolled at least half time, right, the late disbursement cannot exceed the educational costs incurred for the period of instruction during which the student was enrolled during at least half time. What is that saying? Well, I know my student began at least half time. I know that they were in attendance, enrolled at least half time up to this particular point in time. So guess what? I only get to pay them for those educational related expenses up to the point in time, only for the period of time in which they're enrolled at least half time. No more, no less. Now, the interesting thing is we don't tell you how to do this. You get to figure that out on your own. Okay, but that's how you're going to have to determine it. And basically, it's a proration. It's a proration based on the period of time in which the student was actually enrolled at least half time for that payment period. Okay. By the way, this has been in your handbook for a very long time. Most people just skip over it and they don't notice it, but it's there. All right, I have to say this. A lot of you have heard this already. You're prohibited from making a late disbursement, right? If it is a second or subsequent disbursement of direct loan funds unless you graduated or completed the loan period. So if you're like a school who likes to break it up into several disbursements, right, throughout the term, that second disbursement is still considered a second or subsequent disbursement within the payment period, and you cannot make that. Okay? Give them the actual disbursement funds. A late disbursement of direct loan funds to a first-year, first-time borrower who withdraws before the 30th day of the program, right? Unless, of course, just like I was saying earlier, first-time, first-year borrowers, if they didn't meet that 30-day requirement, I can't make that disbursement unless the school's default meets that default waiver requirement. Again, also, you cannot make a late disbursement of Title IV funds to a student for whom the school did not have a valid ISER by the deadline established by the department, okay? Notice that sounds contradictory, doesn't it? But hold on, they had an ISER we already know they had an ISA with an official EFC prior to withdrawal. Why are they telling me this? Notice that I cannot make the actual disbursement. That's what they're talking about until I have a valid SAR or ISA. What they're saying is I have to have now before I actually give them the money and actually make the disbursement. It's not qualifying for it. It's making the disbursement now to the student until they have what? A valid EFC. What does that mean? I have an accurate EFC. What is an accurate EFC? I had the student selected for verification. I may have had an official EFC, but maybe they were selected for verification. Or maybe there was some conflicting information, you see. Not until I have an accurate, or what we call a valid EFC, can I actually give them that money. So that's what this is saying. And again, right, we have that deadline of 180 days. Don't make it after the 180 days, please. That's long enough, right? Now let's talk about post-withdrawal disbursements. Believe it or not, I'm still on late disbursements because post-withdrawal disbursements are a type of late disbursement, right? It's a late disbursement, right, in accordance with an eligible amount determined by the R2T4 rules. So because it's a type of late disbursement that's based in accordance with the R2T4 rules, because now a student has completely withdrawn, there are some special caveats that are attached to a late disbursement, okay? Again, notice I noted step 4 here, and the idea here is that, again, just like I said earlier, here I have a student who has earned more through attendance than what has already been dispersed. So once that determination has been made, they're eligible for a late disbursement, or what we call a post-withdrawal disbursement, and that's in accordance with step 4. Now, if I have a post-withdrawal disbursement, this is the caveat. Again, all those late disbursement rules that I just talked about still apply. Here's the slight differences as it pertains to what we're doing in R2T4 when a student withdraws. A school must provide written notification within 30 days of the date of determination of withdrawal that the student is eligible for a post-withdrawal disbursement. Also, notice this, disperse directly to a student as soon as possible, but no later than 45 calendar days of the determination. That 180-day rule, that's gone out the window. If the student is eligible to receive those funds directly to themselves, you better have it out 45 days from the date of determination, the day that you determined the student had actually withdrawn. So you may have actually waited your full 30 days to do that calculation. Now you only have 15 days, all right, to disperse those funds directly to the student. Dispersed, and by the way, did you notice for Pell, to qualify for a late disbursement, what does that have to do to be ineligible? No longer enrolled. So chances are, there are some rare instances that if you're doing a late disbursement on the basis of Pell funds, it's because of a post-withdrawal. It's a post-withdrawal disbursement, late disbursement, because they're no longer eligible, because they're no longer enrolled. You get it? And again, but guess what? If you're going to disperse the funds against the account, basically for the money that is owed you as an institution, you don't have to do that in 45 days. Take the 180 days to disperse the funds against your own account. The distinction is, who do you owe the money to? Loan funds, again, post-withdrawal disbursement, I'm going to have 30 days to provide them written notification from the date of determination. Same thing. But before I make that post-withdrawal disbursement, I better not make it unless I receive confirmation that the student actually wants you to make that disbursement. So you can't make the disbursement unless you have the student's approval. Now, the key here, though, is let's say you provide for them a deadline, provide their response as to whether or not they want the disbursement. And they don't meet your deadline. You have the option. You're not required to make that disbursement anymore, but you can still make it if you so choose. That is at your discretion as an institution. Okay, but make sure if you're not going to disperse it, you're letting them know in writing as to why you're not going to disperse it. Okay? Also, try to make that post-withdrawal disbursement as early as possible, but no later than 180 days. Notice how we don't care if it's going directly to them. that you get it to them within 45 days. You still have 180 days for direct loans. All right, so we got done talking about late disbursements. Let's talk about retroactive disbursements. Okay, so retroactive disbursements, what I did here is I actually put down here for you the definition, and I underlined particular words so that we understand the distinction between a late disbursement and a retroactive disbursement, because they often get confused. If a school did not make a disbursement to an enrolled student, what is that saying? Number one, my student still has to be enrolled. Otherwise, they're not eligible for that retroactive disbursement. For a payment period completed, okay, I completed a payment period, but I'm still enrolled. You got it? So far, I'm still eligible for that retroactive disbursement. But if I didn't meet those two conditions, I'm not eligible for it. The school may pay the student for all payment periods also in the current award year or loan period. In other words, I still have to be enrolled in the current award year for me to get that retroactive disbursement. You see the distinction here for which the student is eligible? Did you see anything about an ISER having to be applied for and received with an official EFC up here for a condition? You don't, do you? These are the conditions for a retroactive disbursement. I may have completed the payment period, but I'm still enrolled, but I never completed my ISER until maybe in the fall or in the spring. I'm not eligible for a late disbursement, am I? But I might be eligible for a retroactive disbursement, you see? So examples, right? The student's ISER was not available until a subsequent payment period, right? Maybe there was a late FAFSA that was submitted, maybe in a subsequent term. That's okay, they can still go ahead, right? Or there was a reject resolution that was required, okay, and you didn't get it done. Maybe there was an administrative delay that pushed it out further. You're trying to resolve something, and it didn't get resolved until a subsequent payment period, but my student is still enrolled now. That's good. Remember, that's the condition. Okay? For whatever reason, whether it's verification, conflicting information, for whatever kind of reason you can come up with for an administrative delay. Those are some instances in which you might see a retroactive disbursement. All right, this is key. Now, if I'm going to make that retroactive disbursement for a payment period that has already been completed, notice that I can only base it on the calculation of the enrollment status according to work already completed. That Pell recalculation day, all that other stuff, and the add drops and withdrawals, forget all of that. It doesn't apply to retroactive disbursements. Let it go. It's going to be based on work already completed. And by the way, that also includes Fs. So even though you might have a student who is full-time and they got an F in one class and only 3/4 or 9 credit hours are being attributed towards their program because they failed that class, guess what? They still get that enrollment status of full-time. Because it was an earned F, they may not have, in other words, they attended the class for the entire term. They didn't drop it. They just weren't a very good student in that class. They still get the full-time status, you see. That's what we mean by earned F here, okay? But as the language does suggest, it does not include drop courses. I may have dropped some classes maybe 3/4 of the way through the program, or through the payment period, excuse me. And I don't get to count those. It's only those courses that were actually completed, including earned Fs, that I get to attribute towards the enrollment status that determines what they're going to be eligible for, okay? Now that's for, right, Pell Grant funds. Direct loans, same thing, based on enrollment status, according to work already completed, same thing, earned Fs included, but just make sure that they're at least half-time. They completed enough courses to be at least half-time. It's really that simple. Now you're going to see some of these play a little bit later on. It's going to be kind of fun when we talk about regaining eligibility. But let's talk now about Title IV credit balances. Whoops. Now, what is a Title IV credit balance? And I don't like to read screens. I think you figured that out. But I'm going to read this one because I like the way it reads. Right? A Title IV credit balance occurs whenever the amount of Title IV funds credited to a student's account for a payment period exceeds the amount assessed to the student for allowable charges, meaning those institutional charges, associated with that particular payment period. What does that look like in pictures? Well, let me give you an example, what we mean by that, right? So here we have institutional charges, right, in the amount of $3,000. Those are my allowable charges of $3,000, right? I then credit to the account all this financial aid, Pell Grant, direct loans, and look at that, I got a scholarship of $1,000. So my total amount of financial aid is $6,172. But of that $6,172, only $5,172 of that is Title IV aid. I don't care how much of any other aid or other aid contributes towards the exceeding of Title IV aid. So because it's really only $5,172, notice that I have a total institutional cost of $3,000. Notice Title IV aid only exceeds $2,172. You see how my Title IV credit balance is only $2,172? Because my Title IV aid is only $5,172 after I subtract from that the institutional cost of $3,000, right? Because I'm excluding scholarship, that's not Title IV aid. So that's why I only now have a Title IV credit balance of $2,172. Not a credit balance of $2,000, not a credit balance of $3,172, but a Title IV credit balance of $2,172. That's the distinction. And that is the amount that I'm talking about here. Well, what are you talking about? Well, the school has 14 calendar days after the balance occurs if it occurs after the first day of classes. In other words, I have 14 days to disperse these funds to the student or parent, only the Title IV credit balance. By the way, if there is no Title IV credit balance, meaning my Title IV aid does not even meet the allowable charges, but I get this big scholarship, and you may have even a credit balance of $5,000 or $6,000, we could care less as to what, you can wait 30 days for all week here as to when you get that to the student for living expenses. All we care about is what portion of the Title IV aid exceeded the allowable cost. So you have 14 days, notice, if the balance occurs, meaning I dispersed it after the first day of class, after the term began. But if I dispersed it, making an early disbursement, maybe I made it, I dispersed in an early disbursement, meaning 10 days prior to the term beginning, it's 14 days after the start of classes. Notice after the start of classes, meaning if they begin in Module 2 also, I get to wait until after Module 2 begins before I disperse 14 days later that Title IV credit balance to the student. You see that? It's after classes begin, depending upon when you make that disbursement. Now, when is it paid on date, right? Well, it's considered paid on date when you either mail the check within those 14 days. I mailed it. It doesn't mean they had to receive it. I mailed it within the 14 days. Or I notified the student within 14 days that the funds are available for immediate pickup. Okay, now you get to hold that, right, for 21 days from the time you send out that notification. If that's the route you're going to go, just send out that notification within 14 days. I get to hold that money for up to 21 days. But if the student does not claim that money within those 21 days, I have two choices. Either I'm going to return those funds immediately back to the department, or I'm going to disperse those checks, disperse those funds to the student either by check or by electronic fund transfer. Now let's talk about holding a Title IV credit balance. A student or parent may voluntarily authorize you to hold on to the Title IV credit balance, meaning I don't have to send it out within 14 days because they provided for you written authorization for you to hold on to it. Okay? However, if you're going to do that and you receive that authorization for you to do that, you have to make sure that you're identifying what funds are being held for each student and for each parent as far as the credit balance amount in a subsidiary account. And you need to maintain cash equal to the credit balance that is being held in the event that they want to cancel at any point in time. Now, if they decide they want to cancel it, at the time they notify that you want to cancel it, you don't have to give them that money immediately, even though I'm telling you have to have that cash readily on hand. You then have 14 days from the time they provide you notification of cancellation to then disperse those funds, okay? Good news, you get to retain that interest that's accrued on those funds that you hold. All right. So there is a time, right? You have to release it. You can't hold on to them forever. Right? So if you have that authorization, if it's loan funds, the longest you get to hold on to them is during the entire loan period for which those funds were intended. Once the loan period is over, you better have already dispersed those funds. In other words, that holding it, the authorization only lasts for what we call a year, and for the year for which it is received. And we define a year for loans as being the loan period, which is typically synonymous with the defined academic year. Notice how we're not saying award year. And for any grant, any other FSA program, it's within the award year. In other words, the award year cannot end, right, without you having to make sure that the student received those funds. So the authorization is only good for those funds that you disperse and they have a credit balance for that year, and you better make sure that they get those funds before the year is out, depending upon the type of funds, okay, that they've received. Okay? Even with their authorization. Now, what does that mean, though? Some of you say that authorization only good for a year? An authorization is good for multiple years if you wanted to. It's just that in this case, it's only good for that. You can still have the students for when I disperse funds for the next award year. That same authorization that they gave you last year is still good for this second year. It's good for multiple years. It's just that I can't hold on to those funds that were dispersed this year beyond that year or that loan period for which it was intended. Okay? Make sense? All right, let's talk about disbursements when regaining eligibility. And I always get a little depressed because this is something that is very hard to find in your FSA handbook. As a matter of fact, this will probably be one of the only few places that you'll be able to find it. Write that down, okay? So let's talk about disbursements when a student regains eligibility. Must hit that button again. All right. So basically, we have this general rule. When I have a student who is regaining eligibility, a school can award federal Pell Grant funds, teach, and campus-based aid for the current payment period in which they regain eligibility, and for direct loans for the period of enrollment for which was intended. That is the default rule. And what that means is, if I have, for example, a student who regains eligibility in the spring term, or you clock hour schools, the second payment period, right? And this is when they regain eligibility. The general rule that you can always default to if we haven't said otherwise is that Pell, you're only going to get it for starting this payment period forward. You don't get it retroactive. For direct loans, I get it for the period of enrollment, meaning that, guess what? My student attended in the fall or in the first payment period. So I actually not only get it for this payment period, but I get it also for the payment period that is past. Guess what? I'm still enrolled. What kind of disbursement? Retroactive. So I get to make a retroactive disbursement for the payment period that has already passed because it's for the period of enrollment. That is the default response if we don't say otherwise. It's something you can live by, okay? Now, let's look at some examples, right, of things that we specifically talk about. Let's say it's default or an overpayment that was resolved for the first time. The general rule applies. For Pell, if they just resolved it in the spring, for instance, I get Pell starting with the spring term. For direct loans, I get to go ahead and disperse it for the period of enrollment, meaning if they attended the previous payment period, and for this payment period, I get it for both of those. If I am resolving a drug conviction and it just gets resolved during this payment period, same thing as what I just shared with you. Pell, starting with this payment period in which it's resolved, direct loan for the period of enrollment. Okay, it gets interesting, trust me. This is where it gets interesting. It changes. Satisfactory academic progress. Eligible beginning with the payment period during which the student met status for Pell, Teach, and campus-based aid. That's nice. We know that. But it changes for direct loans. Eligible beginning with the payment period during which the student met status. They don't get it. They were not meeting satisfactory academic progress in the fall term. I don't get to make a retroactive disbursement. But can I say something really quick? This is the spring term. I'm going to have a single payment period loan period. For those of you where the student attended in the spring, guess what? I still get the full annual loan limit for that payment period. It's just not a retroactive disbursement, so long as my cost of attendance can handle it. I know. Save your questions till later. Some of you got what I said there, I hope. For those of you who didn't, talk to me later. It shifts again a little bit here, too. Regaining eligibility for, as it pertains to citizenship status, selective service, and a valid Social Security number being resolved. Guess what? It shifts. It's not for Pell, Teach, or campus-based, eligible for the entire award year in which the proper conditions are met. I get to make a retroactive disbursement now for Pell, Teach, and campus-based funds. See how it shifts? This is where it's different. For direct loans, same thing as before, eligible for the entire period of enrollment. You see? Now, if I haven't talked about it, go to the default response. Okay, go to the default response, okay? All right. Again, that's disbursements. Now let's talk about in the event that I have to return those funds, okay? In the event that I have to return funds, for whatever reason, right? Maybe my student wasn't eligible for the full amount, maybe they didn't begin attendance, whatever the case is, those instances in which I tell you have to recalculate or return the full amount, okay, those funds are considered to have been returned. If I transfer them into my federal funds account, it's considered returned. Or if I initiate an electronic funds transfer back to the department, send the funds back. Just keep in mind that if I'm depositing or transferring those funds into my federal funds account, what happens? I better be redispersing those within the next 3 business days, right? To some other student who's eligible for it. You got it? Yeah. Otherwise, if I'm not going to disperse it to anybody else, I better be returning it back through the G5 system, okay? So make sure also if you're returning any funds, please, for goodness sake, we need to know, right? It's part of the reconciliation process that you're making your downward adjustment of your disbursement records in your financial aid system and reporting that to COD. We need you to do that. Otherwise, right, you're out of compliance. We need to have those records accurate. So again, talking about direct loan funds here, right? If for any reason I am canceling or returning any portion of a direct loan, right, that was already dispersed, within 120 days from the times it dispersed, I'm going to return those funds. The school is going to return those funds back to the G5 system if it's within 120 days. If that is at the student's request that you do that, meaning I don't want this full amount, or I don't want any of it, I changed my mind, and it's within 120 days from the time you made the disbursement. You as a school use the G5 system, period. You know why? And this comes from my years as working for a student loan servicer for 4 years, is if they return any portion of those funds within 120 days, that portion is canceled as though there's no interest, as though it never existed. There's no interest that's accrued against it, and there's no fee assessed against that amount that's canceled. It's a beautiful thing. The problem is if we go past the 120 days. If we go past 120 days, the student says, you know what, I don't want $2,000 of that. You say, yeah, okay, here's a servicer, contact them and mail it in. It's just going to be a payment, folks, because the fees and the interest is going to accrue. It's just a payment. So that's their responsibility to contact the servicer and make that payment if they want to do that, okay? Now, if a school has to return funds, by the way, due to a regulatory statutory requirement, for whatever reason, right? Maybe it's a 399. Disbursements were made that shouldn't have been made, or there's an overpayment, right? Even if it's past 120 days, we're going to use the G5 system. Why? Well, whenever the school returns money back to the G5 system, if it's beyond the 120 days, they cancel it and they don't assess any fees. This is why I'm telling you it's important that you don't return that money after 120 days at the student's request through the G5 system, because if you do that, it'll be canceled, and it shouldn't be. It should be a payment. But if it's for any regulatory requirement and it's beyond the 120 days, you better be using the G5, because we're going to reduce that portion. We're going to cancel that portion, so fees and interest are not accrued on that amount. Okay? Good. All right, let's talk about overpayments. I actually think I need to do a session. Thank you. I actually think I need to do a session on this alone next year, so we'll talk about that. But this will probably just create more questions. But it's at the end. I still think I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about overpayments on some level. So again, an overpayment does occur when a student receives Title IV funds in excess of what they're eligible for. They're not eligible for the full amount. Okay? Now this can either be to, as a result of an error the school made, or it can be to a student error. So if it's a result of the school error, then it's what we call a school liability. If it's a result of a student error, or not giving you the correct information, right, then it's a student liability. Why does that matter? Well, for overpayments, right, it means a lot. That's going to tell us who has to return the money, that they received in excess in eligibility. If it's for when it's a school error, it's typically we're talking about administrative errors, right? An unresolved over-award that you should have resolved, okay? An interim disbursement that you made, and they weren't eligible for it upon completion of maybe verification. You're the one who's liable for that. It's a school liability. Miscalculated cost of attendance, payments in excess of loan limits. These are all things that you should have done and made sure before making these disbursements. Remember, I talked about you having a responsibility of ensuring the student's eligibility prior to making that disbursement, and I was very clear about the amounts. Okay? So that's why this becomes your liability, and you have to return it if it's an error done on your part. That's a school liability as a general rule. Notice I'm not going into students because it's myriad. Okay? There's tons. Or it's the student's fault, okay? It's the student's liability. But if it doesn't fall under what I just shared with you, where it's administrative error on your part, something that you should have done, you can basically assume that it's a student liability. Be careful with that, okay? Again, if it's a student liability, you're going to reduce, or either way, any kind of amount, you're going to reduce any, one way that you can deal with this is instead of returning the money, you can just go ahead and try to, if there are any subsequent disbursements within the award year, reduce them by the amount for which there is an over-award. Okay? Or repay the amount for which, just go ahead and pay the amount for which you're responsible. That's the quick way, an easy way, but it's never the fun way, right, according to your administrators. And then as it pertains to students, they can repay their amount for which he or she is responsible and make satisfactory arrangements to repay. I wish there was more I can talk about that, but anyway. So as it pertains to correcting a loan overpayment, right, because that was dealing, this is Pell Grant. A loan overpayment is a little bit different in that if it's not fully dispersed, go ahead and try to adjust any disbursements for the overage, just like we did with the Pell earlier. Or guess what? If the loan is fully dispersed, it's okay. Because guess what? The student's going to pay it back in accordance with the terms and conditions of the loan. So no stress about getting that money back. Again, if it's a student error, make sure that you're notifying the student in writing, requesting repayment for that overpayment, and letting them know that failure to repay or make satisfactory arrangements to repay will result in loss of eligibility. Just make sure that when you do that, the student might come back and say, you know what, it's not my fault, it's your fault. You have to seriously take into consideration their claim that it's your fault, okay? That you may have made the error, and review it accordingly. That's it in disbursements. And I know sometimes this creates more questions than answers. Again, I told you when I started creating this, I realized there's so much more that I can cover. I am available at the Ask a Fed. I do have, I think 1 minute to answer questions. 1 minute. But before I go here, let me show you my resources that are available on all these, both for the FSA handbook. We have the regulations broken down into category as well in your follow-up. And again, feel free to email me or call me with any questions that you may have. Otherwise, I think I got 30 seconds for a question or two, maybe. Or you can come up to me and ask me questions. Thank you. Thank you.